I am Arlene Torres. I direct the Latino Faculty Initiative, and I also am at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. My colleague, Victor Torres, who's a faculty member in Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies, was gracious enough to invite our colleagues to give this presentation today, but he had another commitment and asked me if I would step in, and I must say I was simply delighted to have the opportunity to do so. The director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies extends his welcome to you, and I would like to refer you to a series of events that are taking place throughout the semester. There is a calendar of events outside so that you have the opportunity to attend these additional presentations. A presentation that is coming up on Wednesday, April 4th, focuses on Puerto Rican culinary arts, and if you love food as much as I do, I would encourage you to attend this presentation as well. This evening's presentation is entitled Sexuality and Power in Mayra Santos-Febres' work. But before I turn the podium over to our guests, I'd like to say a little something about my thinking with respect to their work. I do research on the Black diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in the 1980s, in about 81, 82, I began to do research in Puerto Rico on Black cultural identity. I was really trying to understand issues related to race and to the racialization of the Puerto Rican body. And when I went to the island and found myself on the southeastern coast engaged with people with respect to these issues, I found contradictory messages time and time again. Fast forward 25 plus years later, I now find myself at Hunter teaching an undergraduate seminar, and actually one of my students is in the audience, on Black identity in Latin America and the Caribbean and the US. And one of the challenges that I face when I teach is that I need to find multiple ways to engage students with the Black experience. And I'm an anthropologist, and so I provide social science literature, but I also find that I have to expose them to music and to literature and to the arts, because they not only have to read and really pay attention to the power of the word, they also have to experience sensorially with their ears, with their eyes. They have to smell it, they have to feel it. And that's my best hope for them, that they come to embody the Black Caribbean and Latin American experience. That's what Mayra Santos-Febres' work does for me. She embodies the Caribbean, and she embodies the contradictions of sexuality, of gender, of masculinity, of femininity, of class, of race, in such a way that literally it creeps up through my feet. And so today, what I think these authors are going to talk about is that particular kind of embodied experience that is a testament to the power of her work. Reflecting on the variety of media and locations of Santos-Febres' work, they engage in the edited volume Lección Entrante with interview, with bibliography, with academic articles by emergent and established scholars from Latin America, Europe, and the United States. They study Santos-Febres' novels, poetry, essays, and a blog, the embodiment of culture, if you will. The collection also highlights Santos-Febres' role as a mentor to younger writers of the region and the broader lessons that her work offers to changing and contemporary trends in post-colonial and neo-colonial writing and criticism. Our guest, Dr. Nadia Celis, is an assistant professor at Bowdoin College, where she teaches Caribbean, Latin American, and U.S. Latino literature and culture. Her research explores bodies and practices of embodiment, its impact on female subjectivities, and on cultural identity in literature and popular culture from the Hispanic Caribbean. Our second speaker, Professor Juan Pablo Rivera, is an assistant professor of world language studies, at Westfield State University, but I hear that he is going to Clark University in Massachusetts next year. Congratulations. He received his PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures from Harvard University, and he has published scholarly articles on Latin American literature and intellectual history. And he is currently developing an autoethnographic project on non-hegemonic masculinities and body modification. So without further ado, I leave you with our two guests. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Nadia and I wanted to thank the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, in particular the director, Edwin Melendez, and also the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, Latino Studies, in particular Professor Victor Torres Vélez, who invited us, and of course Professor Arlene Torres for her presentation tonight. I just wanted to do a quick show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the work of Mayra Santos-Febres? Had heard about her before? Anyone? Good. Excellent. So I thought that given this context, it would be appropriate for me to narrate the story of my own first encounter with the work of Mayra Santos-Febres, who's become one of Puerto Rico's most important writers today. And from there to discuss how Nadia and I came to decide to work on this project, the book that we're presenting now, Errant Lesson, Mayra Santos-Febres and the Contemporary Caribbean, Lección Errante, Mayra Santos-Febres y el Caribe Contemporáneo. So here is a story of my own first encounter with her work. I first was introduced to the work of Mayra Santos-Febres not in an academic context, but in a diasporic one. I had returned home to Puerto Rico during one of my college vacations. My family is from a relatively small town called Atillo, which matters because books don't get there easily. And my mother handed me a copy of Pez de Vidrio, Glass Fish, which was Mayra Santos' first collected volume of short stories. She handed me a copy of Glass Fish while letting me know that esa muchacha que estudia en Cornell se acaba de ganar no sé qué premio. The 19-year-old me was certainly impressed by the author's credentials, Mayra Santos' credentials, no? Cornell PhD, winner of the Premio Letras de Oro, given to Latinos who write in Spanish in the US. I think it's now defunct, but it had a very nice run, no? The Premio Letras de Oro. Winner, as well as Ana Lidia Vega, another one of our famous writers, of the very prestigious Juan Rulfo Prize for Short Stories, awarded by Radio France Internationale. But frankly, despite all of these accomplishments, I didn't pay much attention to the writing. The cover of the book struck me, however. It shows, enclosed in a pastel lime frame, a woman. The cover shows a woman seated alone, smoking, with deep, long, curly hair. As I would learn a couple of years later, when I actually read Mayra's work in a literature class at Yale, taught by Professor Guillermo Irizarry, who also came to contribute to our book. That lonely mulata woman smoking could be said to symbolize the entirety of Mayra Santos-Febres' work up to that date. The publications of Pez de Vidrio, Glass Fish, and several poetry chapbooks. to that date, 1998 or so. Anamu y Manigua, book of poetry, El Orden Escapado, Tercer Mundo. Pez de Vidrio, just as the novels that would come later, such as Sirena Selena Vestida de Pena, Our Lady of the Night, Any Wednesday I'm Yours, Fenlis Fras, are about women who are profoundly lonely, who experience power in loneliness or writing or desire in loneliness, who from that loneliness, develop an attempt to connect, even through the smallest gesture, which is often a transgressive one, such as that of lighting a cigarette or rushing home to see the next door neighbor undress from across the street, or by handing out business cards, as happens in the short stories collected in the book Urban Oracles. So this, The Woman Smoking Now, collected as short stories called Urban Oracles in English, Oráculos Urbanos en Español. I believe now, as I did then as an undergraduate, that in featuring these urban women in a contradictory attempt to transgress and to connect, Mayra was relocalizing the work of one of her literary mentors, whom you might know, Clarice Lispector, on whom Santos-Febres has written abundantly, with the bodily eloquence, quote, that one admirer, Silvio Torres Seillant, ascribes to her public and academic persona. This is something that we might have seen a little bit of in the interview, this bodily eloquence. By the time her first novel, Sirena Selena, appeared, I was busy preparing my senior thesis to graduate, and remember having read many of the novels written by diasporic Cuban author Severo Sarduy, whom at the time I considered a kind of queer hero. Sarduy, as you probably know, writes about all these drag queens in a very parodic, I shouldn't assume anything, writes about all these drag queens in a very parodic, joyfully queer way, where the political subtext is often only implied or rendered secondary to the formal experiments of the text. This, quote, supeditación or backgrounding of the political does not occur in the case of Sirena Selena Vestida de Pena, translated as Sirena Selena, Selena. It's difficult to pronounce in English. The novel that arguably made Mayra Santos, quote, famous, published in 2000 and re-edited later at least twice, one of these times by Professor Debra Castillo from Cornell University, who had been Santos-Febres' teacher there, and who would later go on to contribute an author's profile for our collection, for Errant Lesson. I have read this novel, Sirena Selena, which is about a 15-year-old drag queen, Puerto Rican drag queen, who goes to the Dominican Republic to work with one of her mentors, Marta, okay? And she has a great voice, hence the name Sirena. So I have read Sirena Selena with my students and can't shake the impression that it was a novel written as it was read. That is, to a lesser extent than other popular Puerto Rican texts like Macho Camacho's Tea, Guaracha del Macho Camacho. Oral imagery abounds in an attempt to recycle while renewing what some critics have called, quote, tropes of tropicalism, the ways in which subaltern Caribbean cultures are viewed and subsumed by a more powerful Anglo-European one. So Sirena Selena, this somewhat famous, relatively famous novel, was a conflictedly eventful text in Puerto Rican letters, from its publication with a transnational mega editorial house to the widespread critical attention that it has received, which included a monographic volume by Centro Journal, to the uncanny sense of deja vu that it may at times elicit to those who have read novels about drag queens and about kids in the Caribbean. To its positive reception amongst critics, students, and one supposes an imaginary reading public. So it has been a relatively successful novel, no, in terms of its readability, its reading public, success with critics, and so forth. In other words, we're all waiting for the movie. We're all waiting for this movie, Sirena Selena movie. Thanks to the critical attention that Sirena Selena had already received, Nadia and I decided to only include one article devoted to it in our book, which is a collection of critical essays about Mayra Santos-Febres' work, as Professor Torres mentioned. To choose one, we thought that we would choose an article that had helped change the direction of the critical conversation around Sirena Selena. And we found it thrilling that such an article existed already and that it had been written by a diasporic Basque scholar, Irune del Rio Gaviola. From the beginning, Lección Errante, the book that we're presenting today, was a transnational conversation. I met Nadia Celis at a conference during my first visit to her native Cartagena de Indias, where I had gone to present on Mayra Santos' poetry, which to that date had received very little critical attention, despite the fact that Mayra considers herself primarily a poet, even though she has written already 4 novels, thinks of herself primarily as a poet, and even though she has received international acclaim and international awards for her short stories, still thinks of herself as a poet. A journal issue at that time was already in the works, and Nadia asked if I could contribute my piece on her poetry. I like to tell this anecdote because, as I learned in that conference in Cartagena, Colombia, and in subsequent visits to Colombia, the quote Atlantic coast of Colombia, which is not even called the Caribbean coast, is a contested space vis-a-vis the insular Caribbean, Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic and Cuba, much like Puerto Rico's status as a Latin American nation is frequently in question. As we mentioned in our introduction to Lección Errante, Errant Lesson, one of the greatest compliments that a scholar can pay to an author's work lies in its replication under a different guise. Through this publication, we accept Mayra's invitation to establish connections between countries and cultures, to vindicate the pleasures of the body and the knowledge that may be located in such pleasure. And, as Professor Doris Sommer put it, to celebrate the openness that the fruition of knowledge has always had in a Caribbean context where it's not closed. Okay? Thank you. That's all I have to say. And now I'll leave you with Nadia, who will be the main presenter tonight. Sexuality and Power in Mayra Santos-Febres' work. Thank you.
Okay, I wish that I were going to do such an anecdotal presentation as Juan Pablo, because I have my problems when I have to present in academic language. So bear with me. I'm going to tell you the story on why is that this is called Sexuality and Power in the Caribbean. In Mayra Santos-Febres' work. Actually, the full title of the presentation for tonight, the one that I'm going to be reading now, is Heterotopies of Desire. I'm going to explain later what is this word, heterotopies. You might already be familiar with the word utopy, that is familiar to this one. Heterotopies of Desire, Sex, Money, and Power in Mayra Santos-Febres, Caribbean. And this is a sketch and a translation of one of the articles that is in the book that we are introducing today. And I'm going to start with a quote from that interview that you were seeing at the beginning, where in the part that we got to show, she was started to talk about the way how she started to write, but the interview also includes a long discussion on Caribbean culture and Caribbean identity, and in particular on the place of bodies, embodiment, bodies, languages, sexuality, sex in the Caribbean. That is one of the main issues that she discusses in her work, that she comes back permanently in her work. She's striking by the fact that her books are always read with that focus on bodies, because she has in her work actually inscribed bodies in a very particular way, and it's of course attractive in the way that the Caribbean, it all is attractive to people because of the sensuality that she transmits both in the subjects of her work, but also in the language. So one of the things that she mentions in the interview is how the type of representation that she wants to do of both sexuality and the bodies is something more complex than the way how it's been seen from our usual reading of these things, our Western ideas on sexuality, that sex and sexuality are more considered as an energy that connects people, and that bodies are considered as creative agents that communicate and that produce the language. I'm going to quote just one of her insights on this condition of bodies, and then I'm going to go on with my own discussion of her work. And she says, marginalized people learn to speak with the body. There have been always powers saying, you are going to shut up. So you must speak with other languages. A language particularly difficult to codify is that of the body, because there is always room for ambiguity in it. There are many bodies that know how to speak that way. It's been said that walking and being in the Caribbean comes about in a certain way, and this is an expression that is famous, that it was made famous by the writer Antonio Benitez Rojo, who say that the Caribbean way to be might be resumed in this certain way of moving, performing, etc. And she says that certain way is directly referred to those languages of bodies. So I'm going to start introducing kind of the theoretical framework that I'm using to read the bodies and sexuality in her work. So the first part of the paper is called Bodies, Mobility, and Sexual Transactions in the Caribbean. And I'm going to be reading and talking a little bit. So thinking the Caribbean from the body, meaning considering the embodied histories, politics, and aesthetics that shape the region, is an imperative project for a society founded on the violent incarnation of colonial and patriarchal power. The corporeal consciousness of Caribbean people, enacted in their propensity to rhythm, performance, in their sensuality, is a recurrent theme in the popular perception as much as in the theoretical discussion of Caribbean cultural identity. I usually ask my students in the first class on Caribbean that I teach this class that is called Beyond the Postcard. And I always ask them, the first question is, what do you think, what comes to your mind when you speak about the Caribbean? And of course, there is always the landscape. There is always the movement, the music, the salsa, the heat, and in direct or indirect ways, there is always, of course, sex. So, and sexuality. So there is always this recurrent theme of bodies. Taking as depository of historical memory, Caribbean bodies have also been, in recent decades, a pillar of numerous aesthetic and theoretical efforts to understand and rewrite the colonial past. It is also Benitez Rojo's idea that the bodies carry memory, and that the many things that have not been discussed in the annals of history, on the official history, can be carried through bodies' memory. The reconsideration of bodies, subjectivity, and identity from a variety of disciplines and theories has supported the increasing understanding of not only the role played by the appropriation of bodies in the formation of the Caribbean, but also of the variety of bodily resistance of its people against their consumption. And this consumption term is a term by a sociologist called Mimi Scheller, who points at the fact that the way how the Caribbean took place was actually by an appropriation through a series of activities of the body energies of the native people, forced labor, punishment, disease, sexual and reproductive exploitation, among other forms of intimate violence that, as suggested by Mimi Scheller, have printed the forces of global economy in the flesh of indigenous and Black people in the Caribbean. Scheller highlights how these practices of appropriation of the body are the origin of, on the one hand, the sexual and racial politics that continue to define the Caribbean as an Edenic space suitable for the exploitation and enjoyment of its nature and inhabitants by local elites and visitors.
On the other hand, these practices are also the origin of the deployment of playful and erotic energy in popular practices of embodied freedom, that is how she calls them, from dance and performance to sexual transactions with which the Caribbean people have claimed their bodies as their own. So there is always this tension in the way how the body is considered both the place where power is inscribed and then at the same time the energy that allows, the place where the people is allowed to claim their own freedom. Despite the attempt of regional literature, criticism, and theory to translate embodied memories and knowledge, the mutual dependence of bodies and power has elicited conflicting trends in their interpretation, which contrasts with the versatility of experiences and the notorious body awareness of Caribbean subjects. So there is always, from the part of theory, kind of a more conservative way to read what is actually happening with the bodies of the people out there. And one of the things that tends to happen is that at the moment of reading these bodies, they tend to be considered just as a symbolic thing. And they also tend to be considered as docile to power. And one of the things that the women writers in particular have denounced is that issues of race and class and the appropriation of bodies in the context of colonialism take over the place of sexual difference, and that even in the new claims of the body and its freedom, you see the sexism of the patriarchal appropriation that continues to be there after colonial times. So one of the things that these writers have done in order to make this visible is actually what some critics call making public the pubic. So making sexuality an actual, displaying sexuality in a way that will somehow call attention to the contradictions embedded in the description of bodies by male writers, even Caribbean natives male writers, and their appropriation of what somebody calls the cannibalism of female bodies in literature and in the culture. And the work of Mayra Santos-Febres uses this strategy in a very unique way, both evincing her commitment to the emancipation of subjugated bodies and also trying to give legitimacy to the languages and knowledge that these bodies carry. Bodies are the core trope of Mayra Santos-Febres' poetics, the site where all of the power relationships materialize, as well as the archive and the active memory of traditionally marginalized subjects who speak up in her work to tell a history of oppression, but also of resistance, where the excessive energy mobilized by desires and pleasures is constantly defying the confines of reason. So she's both telling the history of how these bodies have been subjugated, but at the same time, she's also telling the history of how these bodies responded. Transvestites, prostitutes, migrants, motel workers, and customers, both enslaved and free black women, all of them highly eroticized subjects. Santos-Febres' main characters capitalize this energy, the erotic energy, in their continuous negotiations for autonomy and social power. Through both private and public deployments of interbodily relations and sexuality, these characters exercise not only sexual agency, but alternative forms of citizenship, pertaining not only to the control of sexuality, but to the control of time, space, movement, labor, knowledge, kinship, that, as also argued by Mimi Scheller, resists the constrained heteronormative sexualization and hierarchical racialization of legal citizenship. So they are exercising a different type of citizenship. Not the legal one, the formal one, but new ways of appropriating the space and of creating their own way to be. And the effectiveness of Santos-Febres to reproduce these forms of being and living has been attributed to the expression of her own experience and imaginary as a black woman, whose own fragmented identity suggests the inability of the Western split between body and mind to account for the complexity of subjectivity. The agency that this writer infuses to her protagonist is also supported by a unique topography and by a permanent displacement that emulates the translocal or the movable conditions of Caribbean citizens. Santos-Febres locates her protagonist in streets, parks, public bathrooms, planes, hotels, plazas, sites where the urban experience reveals itself is as fragmented and difficult to apprehend, as well as in those temples of desire, which marginal circuit are the scenario of her first three novels, Sirena Selena, Vestida de Pena, o Sirena Selena, as it was translated in English, Cualquier miércoles soy tuya, Any Wednesday I'm yours, y Nuestra Señora de la Noche, Our Lady of the Night. In this essay, in this presentation, I'm going to sketch a reading of the cabarets, motels, and brothels in the novels of Santos-Febres as metaphors to the Caribbean and its relations with the industrialized countries in the post-colonial context. Examining the dialectic between bodies and marginal spaces, as well as the patterns of mobility of her protagonists, I highlight the different forces intersecting with desire and sexuality in these places, and the libidinal map of the archipelago of the whole Caribbean suggested by these crisscrossing of movements. The concept of heterotopy, as a concept by Michel Foucault, supports my characterization of the spaces of desire as crucibles of the social forces shaping Caribbean cities. In dialogue with research on tourism and sex work, I emphasize the complicity between these forces and the commodification of regional bodies, as well as the erotic agency that allows Santos-Febres characters to perform anti-normative citizenships and to challenge their marginalization. In line with Les and Guattari's consideration of desire as a socially productive force, I argue that Santos-Febres' stories emphasize the creative role of desire, and we might have, the most familiar way to consider desire is actually as a lack, and it comes from Lacan. We tend to think that desire is something that we are missing, and that's the reason why we try to fulfill this need that we cannot have. And the way how Deleuze and Guattari, among other theorists, have been looking at desire is as an energy that creates and connects, rather than something that is missing. So it's a very particular way to look at desire. And the displacements prompted by the main spaces and characters of her novels also suggest an alternative pan-Caribbean cartography, revealing and resisting the paths drawn by the colonial norm. In the Caribbean of desire, other beings and becomings are rendered possible, and the distinctions between marginalization and agency are blurred, giving place to movable positions, relations, and identities. Santos-Febres' narrative highlights the various forces inscribing the sexuality of subjects historically exploited under the colonial rule and its legacy. However, desire and eroticism are powerful counter-forces in her novels, whose protagonist's agency rests on a unique awareness of their sexuality. The cabaret, the motel, and the brothel welcome the transactions with desire that allow Sirena, an adolescent transvestite that is the protagonist of her first novel, Julian, a writer apprentice and motel receptionist, the protagonist of her second novel, and Isabel the Black, who is actually a historical character, the legendary owner of the biggest brothel in the history of Puerto Rico, who is the protagonist of her third novel, Nuestra Señora de la Noche. And the way how she inscribed these characters in these places allow them to defy their subordination and to overcome their marginalization. These marketplaces of desire, the cabaret, the motel, the brothel, or pinnacles of the sin industries, or the industries, las industrias del pecado, this is how a sociologist from Puerto Rico calls them, the sin industries that proliferate in the region, are also mirrors of realities that exceed their limits, of course, within and beyond the fiction. And so when Santos-Febres is placing these stories in these places, it's actually echoing some questions that the social scientists researching some sex work have made, that have actually been asking for a long time. And in particular, I want to highlight the work of Camela Campadou, who in her impressive history of the prostitution in the Caribbean advocates for an approach to sex work that takes into account the inequalities and complex historical conditions linked to the trade of bodies, without disregarding the various levels of agency of the people participating in these transactions. Kempadu urges to consider the boundaries between external sexualization and the erotic consciousness of subjects themselves. She wonders if it's possible to understand the Caribbean sexual praxis as a source of knowledge, identities, and strategies of resistance without falling in essentialist notions of the native sexuality, and calls to explore the potential for political decolonization implicit in sexual resistances. Santos-Febres' novels rehearse potential answers to these issues. Her selection of spaces reflects an attempt to represent the potential of erotic energy and its relation with other social and economic forces from a wide spectrum of experiences and meanings of sexuality. Santos-Febres resists the spaces that erase, regulate, and/or legitimize sexuality, the house, marriage, maternity, locating her characters instead in these abject places, these rejected places, where sex, money, and power coexist with all kinds of desires. In the bodies circulating in the cabaret, the motel, and the brothel, colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy come together to reveal their complicity with the regulation and the stratification of sexuality. However, it is also in these sites where the lines of escape drawn by desire become evident. The recurrent displacement and relocation of her characters that are usually like trespassing and going out of place, out of their proper place, also becomes a key strategy in the remapping of the Caribbean by Santos-Febres. And this is why the title of the paper is also the Santos-Febres Caribbean. It's what is the kind of Caribbean that she's trying to draw a map. So I'm going to discuss in the second part of the paper these places that I call heterotopies of deviation following Foucault. In Sirena Selena, the libidinal transactions of the protagonists, Sirena and Marta Divine, and the other drags working in the Danubio Azul, this is the name of the cabaret, move from the streets of San Juan to the hotels and resorts of the Dominican Republic. I'm sorry, but we are going to have to leave the questions for then, if you don't mind, because I think some of the questions might be answered actually by listening to the rest of the talk. If you
do many pieces, it's after this is sometimes difficult.
But it's going to be. I'm going to be explaining it right away, and then if I interrupt and explain and answer your questions, I might be also threatening the possibility of other people to follow the ideas. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to continue. So Sirena also evolves from selling her sexual services in the streets to selling the illusion she fabricates around a voice that was not of this world, whose beauty and power is capitalized by Marta Divine, her agent, to transform the boy in a bolero diva, the very embodiment of seduction. In the neighboring island, in the Dominican Republic, Sirena meets Hugo Graubel, a rich landowner who soon will become her lover and sponsor. Meanwhile, Marta discovers the Hotel Colón, a paradise for North American and European tourists in search of Dominican boys, where she plans to launch her international drag queens shows. Between the streets, cabarets, and hotels, the first novel of Santos-Febres outlines a pan-Caribbean circuit of the capitalization of desire. Transvestites, bugarrones, hanky-pankies sell and interchange their shows and sexual attentions for a variety of benefits ranging from basic needs to aesthetic and gender change surgeries. Hand-to-hand with their bodies and sexual desire, jewels, drugs, company, status, glamour, and fantasies are traded and consumed, connecting individuals of diverse races, classes, and cultures in this, I quote, Caribbean of perdition, where people fornicate as if the world were about to end next day, thanks God. And this is in the words of one of the characters. Similar functions are fulfilled by the Tulán Motel in Any Wednesday I'm Yours, Cualquier Miércoles Soy Tuya, and the Elizabeth Darcy Place in Nuestra Señora de la Noche, the third novel. The story of Julián in Cualquier Miércoles takes place in a motel at the edge of San Juan, where men and women uphold their illegitimate desires and mysteries. In Nuestra Señora, the narration of the life of Isabel Luberza Oppenheimer, that, as I say, as a historical character, makes the history of Ponce to orbit around the most famous brothel of the island. The novels share not only the selection of marginal protagonists and perspectives, but the construction of their plot around these marginal places that, as Michel Foucault explains in Of Other Spaces, exist in all cultures in an ambiguous relation with the legitimate social space. Motels and brothels are heterotopies of deviation, that is, sites where individuals confine those behaviors and desires that do not conform to the norm, or places where citizens can temporarily relieve their excessive energies while protecting their public identities, without the risk of being bullied by their unconscious forces. And I quote, "Every country has its mafia, its hidden places that pretend to be something but they are something else," reflects Marta Divine when she first finds the Hotel Cologne. "A small labyrinth where I could lose myself for a little while, where to do what my body requested before running away," Julián says about the Toulon. Luis Arsenio Fornariz, the co-protagonist, and this is the song of the lover of Isabel in Nuestra Señora, refers to the Elizabeths in similar terms. I quote, "A pardonable place, a valve of escape so you could continue to assume the weight of being who you are." Foucault also indicates how, in spite of being transitory and apparently isolated sites, heterotopies have a structural relation to the rest of the space. Julián's description of the Toulon, where he witnesses not only sexual transactions, but also the clandestine negotiations between drug traffickers, union leaders, and eminent politicians, reflects the motel's organic link with the rest of the city. And I quote, "The Motel Toulon includes the internal mechanism of the wheel that makes the city move. Lawyers, dealers, illegal workers, adulterers, all met under the dark sky of Highway 52. The city hid them in her secret places, as if she rejected the existence of the encounters and transactions that she herself propitiates and on which leans her capacity to reproduce herself in all splendor." Heterotopies are ultimately counterplaces, sites where not only subjects and forces incompatible in all other spaces are crossed, but where, I quote from Foucault, "the real sites, all the other sites that can be found in culture, simultaneously are represented, contested, and inverted." Santos-Febres sites entwine the multiple economies surrounding bodies and sexuality, providing a critical view of the amalgam of economic interest of local elites, imperial forces, and the global tourist industry that contribute to the vulnerability, trade, and consumption of certain bodies. At the same time, these spaces celebrate what you could call the empire of desires and the subversion of the rules, distances, and hierarchies governing interbodily relations. The neo-colonial brothel, this is the third part of the paper. The luxurious brothel of Isabel Luversa, the Elizabeth's dancing place, is perhaps the most suggestive of Santos-Febres' heterotopies. Located in the first half of the 20th century, Nuestra Señora, Our Lady of the Night, refers to the colonial roots, the intersections between race, sexuality, and power that Isabel La Negra, or the Black, uses and challenges. While it also chronicles the advent of US economic and military forces that facilitates the capitalization of desire and Isabel's social ascendance. In her discussion of the rise of decency as a marker of citizenship in Ponce at the end of the 19th century, Eileen Finlay notes the centrality of the prostitute, her regulation and segregation to demarcate the borders of a Puerto Rican proto-nation that, I quote, "had no place for uncontrollable women of the popular classes, washerwoman and maids descending of a slave as Elizabeth's mother and godmother, who used to circulate too freely by squares, streets, and bomba dances." It is precisely this citizenship of decency what Isabel defies when she decides to become an emancipated woman, she says, rejecting the son born of her relationship with her white lover, Fernando Fornariz, and taking advantage of the land that he gives her to found her exceptional brothel. The pleasure marketing and the traffic of power forging Isabel's emporium target both the local elites and the new masters, the US coming in. La Negra takes special advantage of the proliferation of US military bases on the island. Although the narration sympathizes with Isabel's audacity to defy her social marginalization, it also questions her participation in the transactions with her pupils, goddaughters, or protegees, first abused and traded by her own relatives and eventually exploited by Isabel. The perspective of the co-protagonist, Luis Arsenio, facilitates the ambiguous portrayal of Isabel. In addition, Luis Arsenio's own trajectory, first his sexual initiation with a mulata at the Elizabeths, his departure from the island to study in the US, the economic decadence of his families and his joining of the US Navy, points to the role of the brothel for the local elite and to the complicity of patriarchy, capital, and imperial power with the control of desire. It is also Luis Arsenio who recognizes from his first visit to the Elizabeths the dissolution of hierarchies that happens in this place. And I quote, that it was governed by rules different from the rest of the city, that in that place the distances between servants and serf were not equal, that the bodies and their humors dared to get closer. After the ritualistic reassurance of his masculinity in the brothel, Luis Arsenio faces the power of a desire that exceeds his control, and that despite his further acceptance of sacrificing these desires on behalf of his social position, it will continue to haunt him and to make him an outsider. Traveling during the wars with the US Navy, Luis Arsenio also finds the Elizabeth reproduced around the world. In less glamorous places, other girls, she says, children still without blood, become a problem to the bases. The soldiers, he says, will eat them by the dozen. The brothels emerging around the military bases, both in Puerto Rico and throughout the planet, point to the bond between sexual exploitation and the expansion of the US military empire. In the novel, the bodies and the sexuality of the local women evolve from being objects of exchange between the natives to participate in the power negotiations forced by the new masters. Puerto Rican's men's anxieties around the newcomers' economical power are partially mitigated by the reassurance of their power on their women. After they realize soldiers are mostly taken by dark local flesh. Thus, Nuestra Señora confirms how racial and gender subordination anchor in both gender and race, subordination anchor in both gender and race persists despite the substitutions of powers in the island. In this context, Isabel's subversion consists not of questioning these rules, but of learning to use them to relocate herself in the network of power, even if her defiance is eventually punished with her murder. And this is for the global brothel, the final part of the paper. The end of the century setting of Sirena Selena, the first novel, inscribes the persistence of the factors that have facilitated the commercialization of particular bodies and subjects, the intensification of sexual transactions in the region, as well as the diversification of its modalities. The inclusion of sexual tourism in Sirena Selena extends the connotations of bodies and sex exchange to the post-colonial relations of the Caribbean, making of the region what Denise Brennan has called a transnational sexscape. And she's playing with the landscape war and the sex war, of course. Sirena's Caribbean is all seductive bodies to the service of a global desire that, like the one of the local elites in the Elizabeths, finds in the islands the space to trigger its fantasies. This world is unfolded in the novel through the story of Leocadio, the Dominican double of Sirena. That means another adolescent homosexual boy that is becoming a transvestite. Fearing the male attention raised by her son, his mother takes Leocadio to Adelina, who welcomes in her house homosexual and orphan kids, creating for them a substitute family. Adelina's house soon becomes an exceptional, entertaining house where her children occasionally bring their sponsors in exchange for gifts and money that they contribute to the family support. The eldest of the boys, Migueles, takes Leocadio to work in the Hotel Colón, where he himself has surrendered to the attentions and gifts of foreign tourists. And this is how the story of Sirena, who is going to the Dominican Republic to sing and to sell herself as a diva, as a drag queen, comes together with the story of Leocadio, who is a local boy, who is physically very similar to Sirena and who the novel suggests is going probably to become the next Sirena. This is how Santos-Febres Caribbean reveals its hidden roots, highlighting its exoticization by the first world, whose visitors go to these islands not only looking for a place to rest, but for the contact with the allegedly natural sensuality of the natives. Like Nuestra Señora, Sirena accuses the silent acceptance by the state and the tourism industry of the marketing of the Caribbean bodies, whose sexuality, as pointed out by Kemala Kempadu, is essential to the production and reproduction of capital and the relations of the Caribbean nations with industrialized countries. And I quote, "The racialized, sexualized bodies and energies of Caribbean women and men are primary resources that local governments and the global tourism industry exploit and commodify to cater to, among other things, tourist desires and needs." Santos-Febres corroborates this observation in the monologue, the only chapter in English in the novel, of a Canadian tourist who explains to another foreigner how, despite its poor infrastructure, the Caribbean offers the best service at an affordable at an affordable price. "The Colón Hotel guarantees the boys," he says, and I quote, "pretty chocolate skin, incredible bodies, even though they haven't lifted verbally in their entire lives. You have to shower them with gifts. Most of them don't even know they are gay yet. They go to bed with you, enjoy the whole thing, but as soon as it's over, they revert back to the Latin lover macho role they grew up with. Anyway, as soon as they figure out that they make more money spending a night with you than in working at the hotel for a whole month, the role changes. Most need the money a lot, and I'm happy to oblige. It must be so tough to be gay in this country." The passage reveals not only the eroticization of Caribbean bodies, but also the predominance of the desires and fantasies of the tourist on the reality of his relations with the locals. The tourist reduces his participation to one of collaboration with the necessities of the natives, denying the economic inequalities promoted by global capitalism that places him or her in advantage in these transactions. As argued by Kempadu, the sexuality of the Caribbean men and women does not operate in conditions of equality in regards to that of European and North American tourists. Rather, global relations of power are inscribed and reproduced on the Caribbean's bodies and energies. In this context, the locals' struggle to participate in the global economy informs that both confirm and question the dominant stereotypes on Caribbean gender roles and sexualities. In the efforts of Isabel to become a woman of means, or her employees to survive under her protection, in Sirena and Marta's attempts to perfect the illusion of their bodies as female, or the transactions of the boys in Santo Domingo with foreigners, Santos-Febres exemplifies the challenges elicited by what Denise Brennan has called a sexual economy based on difference, marked by both unequal opportunities to realize them, but yet also by bilateral ambitions and fantasies. And what these authors are emphasizing once and again is that, yes, there are interests, fantasies, needs that are coming from the two sides, but the way how these things come together is never in equal conditions, pretty much. Brothels, cabarets, and motels are thus heterotopies where the local relations of power are intertwined, but also metaphors of the relations of the Caribbean with the First World. Western upper and middle class find in the Caribbean and its bodies the place to reenact their desires in safe conditions that confirm and allow the reestablishment of their power without threatening their positions, neither the myths that sustain them. However, these places encapsulate a force whose threat is not always contained behind their doors. Santos-Febres' novel recreate also how these centers give place to lines of escape, trespassing, and reterritorialization, that is the changing of the territory. The heterotopies of Sirena Selena, Cualquier Miércoles, and Nuestra Señora host the battle between a sexuality coded by capital and the pleasures as a counterforce to the regulation of desire. Materializing the productive and expansive condition of desire that Deleuze and Guattari attribute to sexuality when it exceeds the confines of power. This is just the conclusion. Sirena desires glamour, elegance, the spotlight that will enhance and authenticate her diva pose. Marta Divine wants to complete her creation through a surgery aimed to make her body agree with the perception of herself as a woman. Isabel wants social recognition, a citizenship that she accesses by the way of administrating her customers' desires. Julian wants to create, to write, to find a voice to tell stories. In order to achieve these desires, each of them goes through the metamorphosis imagined by Deleuze and Guattari, a becoming minority, that is, the acquisition of an awareness of their marginalization, and the reterritorialization, changing the meaning, changing the space of their difference beyond the meaning imposed by the colonial and patriarchal worth. Ultimately, Santos-Febres' heterotopies are privileged spaces of body consciousness and vortexes of the expansion of desire. The path suggested by Santos-Febres' writing redraw the map of desexualized Caribbean, both space and machine of desire, refusing the roots fixed by the racist norm and opening them to new beings and becomings. The Caribbean of Santos-Febres materialized the intensities, rhythms, and energies of the popular Caribbean, where several desiring machines coexist together, those of sexuality in its obvious complicities with power and capital, and those of pleasures and other desires that constantly mobilize Caribbean subjects. Thus, in Santos-Febres' Caribbean, bodies speak, as you say at the beginning. They speak of the complicity between sexuality and power, of the patriarchal schizophrenia towards pleasures, or about pleasures, of the violence of capital and patriarchy, and also of the impossibility, in spite of everything, of annulling the power of desire. Foucault, who I've been quoting because of his essay on heterotopias, ends his essay suggesting that next to brothels, colonies are the extreme heterotypical space, or heterotopical space. The Caribbean of desire, cabaret, motel, brothel, is the largest deviation heterotopia, a real place yet inscribed in the global imagination as the embodiment of excess, mirror, synthesis, and refutation of the post-colonial order and the inequalities sustaining it, of its adjections and contradictions. In the heterotypical Caribbean, where time is suspended and deviation is allowed, the courses of reason and capital meet to the verge and make possible the coexistence of all desires.
Any prognosis in terms of women and what other women have undergone, that is, looking at certain parallel historical phenomena in countries such as Palestine, Algeria, Vietnam, Cuba, and the People's Republic of China, where you've had major revolutions in terms of transitions, transformations, and sexual, gender, and political and economic emancipation.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, in Nuestra Señora de la Noche, one of the two main characters, Luis Arsenio, travels because he becomes part of the U.S. Navy. And he travels with the U.S. Navy to many different countries, among them the Philippines. I think he goes to Vietnam as well. So he does witness how this phenomena that she is describing in the island also repeats itself in so many other places. And she's clearly suggesting in this portrayal how is that there is a connection between the expansion of this imperial power and the capitalization of the bodies of these girls. And she points also to the fact very clearly of that is very little girls, that is, very fresh, that there is always this exoticization coming into place, that is usually darker color or exotic bodies, the ones who are particularly vulnerable to this commercialization, and there is every time younger girls. And even she points to the fact that there is always kind of a struggle from the locals to survive through these relations with the newcomers. In the original article, I also used the work of, oh my God, the name is not coming at this time to me, but there is this author who works on the place of women in international relations, and studies in particular how is that the way how the U.S. designs its military interventions and whether if the bases, for example, host the families of the soldiers or not, has a lot to do with this international diplomacy and the way how they conceive of the other countries. Let's say if you create a U.S. base in France, you will take the families because the local men would not allow for the soldiers to have access to the women. But if you take your base to a third world country, you can afford to take the soldiers, and the local women will have to pay the consequences and will have to provide for the sexual services and the attention that the soldiers would not have from their own families. You see?
Get into anything in terms of self-hatred, which of course was imposed upon colonial people by the neo-colonials and the imperialists.
Excuse me?
Self-hatred.
You mean from the locals?
Hatred of oneself. That is the internalization of this stereotype.
Well, actually, yes, but she's also at the same time, I mean, on the one hand, she tells the stories of these women who prostitute under the protection of Isabel, and she questions such protection because she's at the one time, narrating the history of a story of success in achieving a certain social status and social power, but at the same time, she's also recalling the fact that there are victims of these, that is, these girls. And yes, she does portray the inner contradictions of the people who is involved with this. Sirena, the character in the first novel, for example, she prostitutes herself, and before she even becomes a woman, but she's still a boy, he prostitutes himself, and I know we have had this discussion on this before, but the novel doesn't exactly say it, but he's a victim of rape in the story. So there is a lot of violence going on against these people. And there is, of course, a lot of the process of interiorization of, the subjugation situation that they are in. But I think she makes sure to make a point of the fact that this is not people who can be defined as victims exclusively. That this is people who is choosing among those conditions that they have not chosen how to negotiate the power that they can have access to through their sexuality. You see, it's not conditions that they choose, but within these things, they have to, what the Puerto Ricans call bregar, but this pretty much negotiate.
To deal, yeah.
To deal with,
Two things. One, I think you touched a little bit about this, but first of all, there's a lot of other countries and regions of the world that have been historically colonialized and exploited.
Mm-hmm.
However, the Caribbean stands out on that perception of sexuality. Maybe Brazil might be another point.
Sure.
I was wondering, what makes it different? I mean, why not Mexico, for example? Why not Bolivia or Peru? Even though, we know that Maria Sosa has a lot of literature on the brothels in Peru, but just to comment on that. The other is, where is that fine line between reinforcing a stereotype and using that language to challenge the hierarchy relationships? Because you still want to hear things like, well, Mayra Santos-Febres embodies the Caribbean. I remember this, the Caribbean is all about sexuality, it's all about, it kind of reinforces the same thing. It's like, can we use other languages besides the body language to challenge the hierarchies of power? It seems like we're left only with this, the bodies as a way to contest domination. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, I'm going to start with the second question because I think that way I will remember better. It's risky what she's doing, for sure, because on the one hand, it's true, she's enacting things that leads that lead to the confirmation of some stereotypes on the Caribbean. On the other hand, she's trying to also, in the same movement, to present this in a more complex way. And I would say that what she's trying to point at is to the fact that there is more going on in those body languages that has been emitted from the Western paradigm. That, so answering to whether we can talk about this, make resistance beyond the bodies, what I think is happening in her and in some other authors coming back to the bodies, is that they are recognizing that over 5 centuries of colonialism and neocolonialism and post-colonialism, because of the violence that was exercised on Caribbean people in so many different ways, people had to speak with their bodies. People had to archive knowledge and memories on their bodies when they had no access to words and to language. So now, what they are trying to do is not only speaking with bodies, but to give to those knowledges an epistemological status. To say, like, there has been knowledge being produced in the Caribbean. It's a knowledge that you cannot recognize under the Western paradigm because you do not accept any other knowledge than the one led by reason. You see? So, but there was a history going on here, and there are so many things we have been saying through our bodies for such a long time. And what they are doing as fiction writers, I would say less in the theory, more in the fiction writers, is to show the knowledge that there is behind that as a basis to keep on constructing knowledge. It's not that the only way to speak is through bodies. It's that we need to validate those knowledges. We need to bring them back to the history of the Caribbean. We have also to bring them back as a way to encounter what is proper of the Caribbean, if we want to move to the first questions. So I don't think that there is only body resistance. There are more other ways to resistance that are only incorporating that knowledge in the way how they construct ways of decolonization. Because this is what it is about. It's supposed to be about how we find a way to think beyond the colonial hierarchies, how we find a way to think beyond reason. And the body memory is offering an avenue to that. In regards to this, what is special about the Caribbean, wow. There are 400 of us in the Caribbean Studies Association, and I don't think that we represent not even the half of Caribbeanists, and I don't think we have yet answered the question. We are following kind of an intuition, but I can tell you what are the elements that make unique the historical experience that leads to a certain way to express identity, to embody identity. We have gone, the common features I would say that most of Caribbeans highlight is the permanent and so diverse migrations, and the way how is that it has been a place that has been always from the beginning shaped by people who is coming from so many different cultures, from so many different backgrounds, and that is mixing here and finding ways to coexist together. And that I would say this is kind of a Babel, and because of being a place that has so many differences embedded and so many differences that, by the way, they are not coexisting in the multicultural fantasy that we have created right now. They are coexisting in very problematic conditions, but they have had to negotiate survival, power, and just participation, social participation, etc., from the beginning, from very unequal conditions, but also from very different perspectives. And this somehow has led to special, particular expressions of identity. In regards to bodies and the way how bodies speak, I've read several explanations of this. One of them has to do with the amount of violence that these bodies receive. I think it's Gilroy who says that it's proportional. The body speaking is proportional to the incapacity to speak in other ways. So that because slavery was such a big thing in the Caribbean, because the amount of population who have been subsumed by this phenomena, the body has to stand up and talk more than in other contexts because there was no access to language. So that's one of the things that I have been giving as an explanation of why is the bodies speak in this particular way. Another theory that I find quite interesting on how bodies speak in the Caribbean is because of the class divisions and the way how, since it was more of a slave and a black feature to speak with the bodies, there was a very deliberate codification of what it was proper body behavior. So our manners are very centered in how the body moves because of the need of the whiter people to detach from the body expression of the black people. So there was, I would say, a bigger awareness of this, that it is manifesting in many cultural phenomena, but that has not necessarily made its way into what we find of what we call knowledge, you know, theoretical knowledge or like scientific knowledge. So what the writers are trying to do is precisely to move that knowledge, that thing that we know as Caribbean. We just know it. We just look at each other, we just move in certain ways, we just read bodies very spontaneously. But that thing is not always, does not always has the status of a knowledge. So I don't know if I answered your question,
good, yeah.
but
Thank you very much.
I guess I have a comment. I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm coming to it from the perspective of a social scientist and an anthropologist more specifically, who is interested in how knowledge is embodied through performance, through movement, through repetition, and they don't necessarily have to be some of the subject matter that Mayra Santos-Febres refers to in her novels. It can be dance, it can be music, it can be learning artistic ways of doing, ways of walking. And some of these things get incorporated certainly in different ways in her work, but she focuses on a specific kind of embodiment that is linked to these colonial and post-colonial processes. But most folks in Caribbean studies and in the social sciences are really trying to get a handle, theoretically and methodologically, of how to understand embodiment. And so I guess turning to her work is a way for those of us who are social scientists and anthropologists is to explore some of those processes from a historical and literary perspective that could potentially allow us to ask different kinds of questions when we do field work. And I would argue that also is very much the beauty in her work.
And I have nothing to add to that. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think there is a little bit of all of those body species in her work. Yes, the body does not only talk through sexuality. The book that Juan Pablo was referring to at the beginning, Urban Oracles, is amazing in that sense because there's, for example, this adivina. How do you say adivina?
She's like a medium.
Like a medium. Yeah, like a medium who, you know, gives advice to people, and the type of body reading that she's doing, for example, is very interesting. She speaks in her interview about dance as well, and in particular about bomba dance. That is, I would say, the exaggeration of this communication between the dancer and the player that happens, the call and response type of thing that happens all around the Caribbean. In bomba is very obvious, and she speaks of that as a sample as well. And a lot of the Caribbean, you know, work in social sciences, you know, accounts for that type of body speaking. And yes, I think that the reason why she chooses to highlight the sexuality point is because it becomes this connection with the rest of the world, because of the place that it has in global imagination. and global fantasies. So it allows her to respond very directly to those fantasies, and to make it complex in a way that becomes somehow a mirror to the reader from the outside and to the reader from the inside of the contradictions that are surrounding this sexualization of bodies.